the biggest ideas in philosophy. Listen to sleep well. There are nights when you close your eyes, but your mind refuses to sleep. Unnamed questions keep echoing. What am I living for? Why do things happen this way? And if everything were to collapse tomorrow, what would I have left? We live in a world so loud that we forget how to listen to ourselves. We chase success, fear failure, fear being left behind, yet rarely stop to ask, what is truly within our control? It is this empty space that leaves us exhausted, anxious, unable to rest. This video does not come to give you comforting answers. It comes to offer you the greatest ideas in philosophy, from Stoicism to existentialism to deep reflections on the human mind, not to argue, but to help you let go. Through each story, each contemplation, you may begin to realize peace does not come from controlling the world, but from understanding where you stand within it. Let these ideas guide you, more slowly, more deeply, so that when sleep arrives, it is no longer an escape, but a return. Let me whisper to you, slowly, as if we were sitting beside each other on a very late night, when the world has fallen silent, and only thoughts that have not yet fallen asleep remain. Imagine that you are Zeno. Not Zeno from philosophy books, not a symbol of Stoicism, but a human being of flesh and blood. You once had everything: wealth, status, a future that seemed already arranged. And then, in a single movement of the waves, a ship sank. No warning, no negotiation, no time to prepare. Everything disappeared as if it had never existed. In that moment, what hurt you was not only material loss. What hurt most was the feeling of being betrayed by life. The feeling that, I did everything right, so why did this happen to me? But if we become quiet enough, we touch a truth that is very cold and very real. Life never promised anything. Life does not betray. Life simply happens. It is here that Stoicism does not shout, does not lecture. It whispers, very softly, that we do not own this world. We are only passing through it. And when you stop treating life as a possession that must be held tightly, you begin to touch a strange kind of freedom. A freedom that does not come from controlling fate, but from letting go of the illusion that you ever had that control. Epictetus said something so simple it is often overlooked, yet deep enough to change an entire life. Some things are up to us, and some things are not up to us. We do not suffer because of loss. We suffer because we once believed that those fragile things belonged to us. The sinking ship did not only carry away Zeno's cargo, it swept away something far larger. The illusion that life has an obligation to be fair, to be predictable, to follow the plan. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, that moment is precisely when the ego is wounded. The ego, the part of us that believes, if I am good enough, smart enough, correct enough, then life will obey. When life does not obey, the ego panics. It calls this betrayal. But in truth, it is simply the first time we are forced to see reality clearly. We were never the center of the universe. And strangely enough, that very collapse becomes a doorway. When the ego can no longer stand upright, the soul finally has space to speak. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But to become who we truly are, we often must pass through a loss large enough to shatter the old image." Zeno lost everything, and it was in that stripped-down state that he began to learn how to live without relying on things that could be swept away. Stoicism does not teach you to avoid storms. It teaches you not to build your house on waves. It does not promise that life will become lighter, but it whispers that you do not need to carry everything. There are things that were never in your hands, and therefore, you do not need to punish yourself for having lost them. Marcus Aurelius, who lived amid war and plague, wrote to himself in Meditations, You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That strength is not loud. It does not make life bow. It simply causes the mind to stop thrashing in hopeless struggle. And when the mind stops thrashing, energy begins to settle. That settling is not surrender. It is acceptance of reality as it is. If you are listening to these words in a long night, perhaps you too are carrying a sinking ship within you. A failed plan, a broken relationship, a future version of yourself that no longer exists. And perhaps you have also asked, why me? But try asking a different question, a gentler one. What part of this was never under my control? When you can answer that, a very old burden falls away. You no longer need to keep fighting reality. Stoicism calls this freedom. Jung calls it the beginning of individuation, the moment we stop living to force life to obey us, and begin living to understand who we are when life does not. And in that moment, when you stop blaming the waves, stop blaming the wind, stop blaming the ship, you can lie down. Not because you have lost, but because you have stopped fighting what never required a fight. Sleep, then, is no longer an escape. It becomes a permission. Permission for life to happen. Permission not to know tomorrow. Permission for the mind to rest in a very simple truth. We do not own the world, but we can learn to move through it with calm. And when the ship has sunk, when the illusion that life must obey us has shattered, the next question is no longer, why did this happen? But rather, how will I allow this to pass through my soul? Listen very softly. The second scene does not open with a new event, but with a very small inner movement, an almost invisible shift from trying to control the world to learning how to care for the soul. People often misunderstand Stoicism. They think it means coldness, hardness, the absence of feeling. But numbness is the closing of the heart, while Stoicism, in its deepest sense, is opening the heart without allowing yourself to be carried away, not fleeing emotion, and not letting emotion sweep you downstream. Epictetus once said something that sounds simple, but if allowed to sink in deeply enough, it can change how we live through every upheaval. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. We do not suffer because the rain falls. We suffer because we believe the rain should not fall. We are not broken by events themselves, but by the automatic reactions of the ego, the part of us that always wants to control, to predict, to be certain that everything must follow the plan. In the language of Carl Gustav Jung, this is the moment when the ego begins to learn a difficult lesson. It is not the one steering the universe. The ego serves a purpose. It helps us function in the world. But when it imagines itself as the center, every collision becomes an inner catastrophe. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Our reactions to upheaval are rarely conscious choices. They are habits, memories, old fears rising to the surface. Stoicism does not ask us to crush those reactions. It simply invites us to see them. And the moment they are truly seen, they begin to lose their power. We cannot stop the rain from falling, but we can stop the rain from turning into a storm inside. This is not the denial of emotion. On the contrary, it is a rare form of courage to feel fully without identifying yourself with what you feel. Sadness is sadness. Fear is fear, but not saying, "I am sadness. I am fear." Marcus Aurelius, both an emperor and a student of Stoicism, reminded himself in Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That strength is not meant to control life. It is the strength not to lose yourself each time life changes direction. A mature soul does not require a calm world in order to be calm. It learns to hold its inner axis, even as the outer world shakes. In Jungian psychology, this moment marks a vital distinction. I am not my reactions. When we stop identifying with our reactions, a small space opens, and it is precisely in that space that freedom appears. Those who have never trained their inner life are pulled in every direction by each gust of wind. A careless word can undo them. A small change can throw them into panic, not because they are weak, but because they have never learned how to stay with themselves when emotion arises. Stoicism does not harden us, it deepens us. Like the surface of a lake, still enough to reflect the sky, yet deep enough not to be clouded by a small stone. Perhaps right now, you are listening to these words in the darkness of a familiar room. Perhaps today, you face too many things that lay beyond your control. Other people's words, outcomes that disappointed you, an event that could not be undone. And perhaps you tried to be okay by tensing yourself. But Stoicism does not ask you to tense. It whispers, you can relax and still stand. You do not need to defeat your emotions. You only need not to let them drive your life in your place. Jung emphasized that psychological maturity does not come from eliminating the shadow, but from not allowing the shadow to dictate behavior. When the ego stops demanding control of the universe, it becomes capable of something far more important: caring for the soul. And when the soul is cared for, events may still hurt, but they no longer shatter you from within. They pass through, leaving a scratch, but no longer a storm. At this moment, you may allow yourself to breathe more slowly. No need to understand everything. No need to fix anything more. Just remember one very gentle truth. The rain may be falling out there, but tonight, inside you, the sky can be calm. And in that calm, sleep does not arrive as an escape, but as the final act of self-agency of the day. You choose to let your soul rest. And when the storm inside has settled, when we are no longer fighting our own emotions, we begin to lift our heads, not to control the world, but to see who we are standing among. The city out there is still just as noisy. Roads tangled with lights, faces passing one another without time to remember names, parallel lives brushing against each other before turning away. Yet in the Stoic tradition, the city is not a place where people lose themselves. It is a place to practice being human. The Stoics did not teach from ivory towers. They stood in the marketplace, in the dust and noise of everyday life, as if to say, if philosophy cannot be used to live, it is not worth existing. Epictetus was once a slave. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor. Two people at opposite ends of power and status. Yet both learned the same lesson: how to remain steady inside when everything outside is always changing. Marcus Aurelius wrote, not for the public, but for himself. What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee. This sentence is not merely moral advice, it is a way of seeing the world. In the Stoic view, human beings are not isolated individuals competing to survive. We are parts of a larger whole, a wider community, a shared humanity. And here is where philosophy touches psychology very deeply. Carl Gustav Jung observed that the deepest loneliness does not come from being alone, but from feeling that one belongs nowhere. When we believe our pain is unique, that no one could understand, that we have been left behind in the flow of life, that fear quietly grows. Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." Stoicism, in its quiet way, heals this. It does not promise that others will understand you, but it reminds you of something essential. You are not an exception to the human condition. Your sadness is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that you are living as a human being. When we begin to see others as the same humanity, something in the nervous system softens. We no longer need to stay constantly on guard. We no longer need to prove that our pain is justified. We panic less because we stop believing that we are standing alone against the entire world. Epictetus once said something very simple, like a reminder for everyday life. Remember that you are an actor in a play, which is as the playwright wants it to be. You do not write the entire script, but you are standing on the same stage with other human beings, each carrying a role, a burden, a private fear. When you understand this, you stop envying the roles of others. You also stop treating your own role as a sentence. In Jungian psychology, this marks a shift from an isolated ego to the self, something larger than the personal I. When the ego believes it is alone, it panics. When it realizes it is part of a larger story, it no longer has to strain so hard just to survive. Many pains do not come from loss, but from the fear of being left behind. Left behind by others' success. Left behind by the forward movement of life. Left behind even within one's own family, one's own relationships. What we fear most is not suffering, but suffering alone. Stoicism does not soothe this fear with sweet promises. It simply places a steady hand on your shoulder and says, "You are here, among other people who are also trying to live with decency." And sometimes, that alone is enough for the heart to stop tightening. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself each morning, "Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial." He did not write this out of bitterness. He wrote it to prepare the mind. Human beings are human beings. And if we expect life to be only pleasant, we will be endlessly disappointed. But when we accept that all of us are struggling in our own ways, the heart softens. When the heart softens, we no longer need to build such high walls. We can step into the city, not in a defensive stance, but with the awareness of a citizen of the world. No one here is perfect, but no one is entirely a stranger. Perhaps tonight you are listening to these words with a very private feeling that you belong nowhere. But try to notice, the city is breathing with you. Other people are also carrying unnamed worries, also searching for ways to stand upright through another day. Stoicism whispers, you do not need to stand out in order to belong. You only need to acknowledge that you are human among humans. And when you allow yourself to belong to this humanity, something very gentle happens. You feel less alone. When you feel less alone, you panic less. And when panic settles, your body remembers what it has known for a very long time. You are not walking alone through the night. At this moment, you may let your eyes close. There is no need to think anything more. The city out there will continue. And you, like every other human being, have the right to rest in this simple truth. And when we no longer see the city as something that threatens us, when we stop panicking under the gaze of others, the next step happens very naturally. We return to the body, the place every philosophy must ultimately pass through. There are practices that sound strange at first. Sleeping on the floor, cold showers, simple meals. They sound like asceticism. They sound like self-punishment. But in the spirit of Stoicism, these are not ways of punishing the self. They are reminders that we are still alive, even without comfort. Seneca once gave his friend Lucilius a very concrete, very human piece of advice. In Letters from a Stoic, set aside a certain number of days, during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, is this the condition that I feared? That question, is this the condition that I feared, is the very heart of voluntary discomfort. We do not do this to become stronger than others. We do it to loosen a very deep fear, the fear that without comfort, we would collapse. But the body does not think that way. The body learns through experience, not through theory. When you lie on a cold floor, when cold water touches the skin, when a simple meal does not cater to craving, the nervous system begins to recognize an essential truth. Discomfort is not the same as danger. In the modern world, we have unknowingly trained the body in the opposite direction. Every small discomfort is treated as an emergency. Every inconvenience must be removed immediately. And a nervous system that has been indulged for too long begins to overreact to every deviation from comfort. Stoicism understood this clearly, even without the language of neuroscience. They knew that the easiest person to manipulate is the one who fears discomfort. When we fear cold, fear hunger, fear lack, fear inconvenience, the outside world gains the strings very quickly. Epictetus once said something that sounds harsh, yet carries deep liberation within it. If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Not foolish in the sense of ignorance, but willing to endure the discomfort of going against habit. Willing not to chase immediate comfort. Willing to let the body relearn this truth. We can endure more than we think. In the psychology of Carl Gustav Jung, this touches a very deep layer. Jung understood that the ego always seeks safety, familiarity, and ease. And precisely because of that, the ego is also easily controlled. Jung once wrote a short sentence, heavy enough to carry for a lifetime. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Consciousness does not grow in the comfort zone. It grows when we stay with a sufficient degree of discomfort. Enough to learn, not enough to break us. Voluntary discomfort is how we choose that degree ourselves, instead of letting life impose it in a far harsher way. Sleeping on the floor does not make you a stoic. Cold showers do not make you enlightened. Simple food does not make you superior to anyone. But they do one quiet thing. They reduce dependence. And each time dependence lessens a little, the ego matures a little. An immature ego needs everything to go its way in order to be at peace. A mature ego can be at peace even when things are imperfect. When we no longer panic at discomfort, we are less manipulated by advertising, less pulled by comparison, less driven by the fear of lacking to run faster than others. We no longer need to react urgently to every small inconvenience. In very simple terms, we stop being pulled by the strings. Perhaps you are listening to these words at night, when the body finally lies down. Perhaps tomorrow you will not sleep on the floor, will not take a cold shower, will not eat more simply, and that is completely fine. Stoicism is not a checklist. What matters more is the spirit behind it. We are not so fragile that we must be protected from every discomfort. We are alive enough, breathing enough, steady enough, even without a few layers of padding. When the body learns this, the mind softens. When the mind softens, the world feels less threatening. And when the world feels less threatening, we no longer need to strain ourselves to control it. Jung once said that maturity is not becoming rigid, but becoming flexible, soft enough not to break, solid enough not to dissolve. Voluntary discomfort is one very quiet way to train that flexibility. At this moment, you do not need to remember anything. Just allow the body to grow heavier on the bed. Allow yourself not to need perfect comfort in order to rest, because when the body remembers that it is still okay, the soul begins to believe it too. And in that very simple trust, sleep arrives, not as a reward, but as something natural for one who is no longer afraid of life's imperfection. And when the body has learned that discomfort does not mean danger, When we stop being pulled by the world through small inconveniences, a deeper question naturally arises. In this life, what truly lies within our hands? Imagine that you are holding a pen, and before you is a blank sheet of paper. On that sheet, Stoicism invites you to draw a very thin line, so thin that if you are not paying attention, you might forget it exists at all. Yet it is precisely this line that separates peace from suffering. On the left side of the line are the things you can control: your effort, your attitude, the choices you make when facing life. On the right side of the line are the things you cannot control: outcomes, praise, recognition, fortune, the way others see you. It sounds simple, but most human suffering does not come from not knowing this. It comes from living as if the right side belonged to us. We invest our emotions, our identity, our sense of worth into things that were never under our control. Epictetus states this very plainly in the very opening lines of the Enchiridion. Some things are in our control and others not. And he goes on, if we confuse these two domains, inner life becomes an endless chain of reactions. We feel elated when praised. We collapse when criticized. We hope when outcomes favor us. We despair when things slip from our grasp, not because life is too cruel, but because we placed our hearts in the wrong place. In the language of Carl Gustav Jung, this is not merely a philosophical mistake. It is an illusion of the ego. The ego wants to believe that if it tries hard enough, is smart enough, is correct enough, it can control outcomes. That illusion grants a temporary sense of power, but it is also the source of deep anxiety. Jung once wrote, "The ego is only the center of consciousness, not the center of the personality. The ego is not the whole of who you are. But when it dreams that it stands at the center of all outcomes, it begins to carry a burden it cannot bear." And every time life refuses to obey, the ego panics, becomes angry, or collapses. The dichotomy of control does not exist to make us passive. It exists to return control to its proper place. When you focus on effort instead of outcomes, on attitude instead of feedback, on choice instead of recognition, something very strange happens. Energy is no longer scattered. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this in the midst of war and plague. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. Suffering does not lie in the event. It lies in how we appraise that event. And that appraisal, most of the time, comes from believing we had a claim over things that never belonged to us. In depth psychology, this is the moment of waking up from the dream of power. We do not wake up to see ourselves as weaker, but to see ourselves as lighter. Lighter because we no longer have to carry responsibility for the outcomes of the entire world. Lighter because we no longer have to control the gaze of others in order to feel worthy. Once the line becomes clear, we no longer need to chase every external signal. We no longer need to constantly check how we are being evaluated. We do the work that is ours to do, and then we allow the outcome to follow its own path. This does not kill motivation. On the contrary, it purifies it. We no longer strive in order to be loved. We strive because it is the right thing to do. We no longer choose in order to be approved. We choose because the choice aligns with our inner values. Jung once said something very quietly, yet if heard deeply, it opens an entire doorway. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. Choosing who you become, that belongs on the left side of the line. What happens afterward, let it remain on the right. Perhaps right now you are listening to these words in a familiar state. The mind circling around things that have not yet happened, worrying about outcomes, wondering what others will think. fearing that your efforts will not be rewarded? If so, try this just once, tonight, and place everything back on its proper side of the line. No need to resolve anything. No need to conclude. Just place it back. What you have done to the best of your ability. Let it rest. What was never in your hands, release it gently. Peace does not come from life becoming predictable. It comes from no longer living in confusion. When the line is clear, the mind becomes less tangled. When the mind becomes less tangled, the body softens. And when the body softens, sleep finds its way home. Stoicism does not promise a life without chaos. Jung does not promise a mind without shadow. They only point to something very humble, yet powerful enough to redirect an entire life. Wake up from the dream that you can control everything. When you wake up, you do not lose power. You simply stop carrying a power that was never yours. And in that very quiet moment, when everything has been placed where it belongs, you may close your eyes. No need to grip tightly. No need to let go forcefully. Just allow life to flow on the right side, while you rest on the left, where breath, effort, and your quiet choices are peacefully waiting. Sleep arrives as a natural consequence of that distinction. No forcing, no struggle, just a thin line, and a mind that has finally stopped stepping into what was never its own. And when the line of control has become clear enough, when we stop carrying responsibility for outcomes that were never ours, a quiet question naturally arises next. If we cannot hold the world in our hands, then what will keep us standing when the world begins to shake? Stoicism's answer is not an emotion, nor a vague belief. It is the four virtues, not as moral slogans to hang on a wall, but as the spine of a person who does not break when life becomes chaotic. The first virtue is wisdom, not being more intelligent than others, but knowing with clarity what lies within your reach and what does not. Wisdom is the ability to look directly at reality without deceiving yourself. It is the small light that keeps you from stepping across to the right side of the line, where things beyond your control are always waiting to drain your energy. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself with a sentence that is brief and awake. If it is not right, don't do it. If it is not true, don't say it. Wisdom does not need justification. It only needs honesty. And that honesty keeps the mind from being torn apart by unrealistic expectations. The second virtue is courage, not recklessness, not the absence of fear, but remaining steady while fear is still present. Courage, in the Stoic sense, is not about suppressing fear, but about not allowing fear to decide your actions. Epictetus expressed this very simply. He who fears death will never do anything worth of a living man. Fear is a natural reflex. Courage is a choice. When life shakes, when everything feels uncertain, courage is what prevents us from betraying our values just to grasp at temporary safety. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment when the ego learns not to retreat before the shadow. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Courage is staying with the darkness without letting it take the wheel. The third virtue is temperance, a word that may sound old, yet is profoundly modern. Temperance is not deprivation. It is knowing what is enough. In a world that constantly stimulates us to want more money, more achievement, more recognition, temperance is the ability to stop before the ego consumes more than it can digest. Seneca offered a gentle warning. It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more. That is poor. Many minds collapse not because of lack, but because they never know when to stop. Temperance keeps inner life from becoming overloaded. It creates the space we need to breathe, to sleep, and to avoid being pulled into the endless hunger of comparison and desire. The fourth virtue is justice, not only refraining from harming others, but remembering that we are born to belong to one another. Justice, in Stoicism, is not moral judgment. It is the recognition that we are part of something larger than the personal ego. Marcus Aurelius expressed this with deep humility. What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee. When we live only for ourselves, the mind eventually contracts into loneliness. When we remember that our actions touch others, we naturally live more slowly, more gently, and with less violence, toward the world and toward ourselves. In Jung's language, these four virtues are not good things one should do. They are psychological structures that prevent the ego from shattering when the unconscious rises. When life becomes chaotic and events arrive in rapid succession, it is character, not emotion, that keeps us standing. Jung once said something very quiet and very true. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. The four virtues are not rigid formulas. They are a compass. They don't tell us where to go. They simply keep us from losing our direction when the fog is thick. Perhaps tonight you are tired, not because you lack knowledge, but because you lack a point of support. Everything out there is changing too fast. Values are shifting. Standards are blurring. And you find yourself asking, what can I lean on so I do not collapse? Stoicism whispers, lean on how you live, not on what you achieve. Wisdom, so you do not lose your way. Courage, so you do not betray yourself. Temperance, so you do not erode yourself from within. Justice, so you do not isolate yourself. When these four pillars are present, life may still be noisy, but inside there is something steady. Not blind faith, not radiant hope, but a deep, slow, enduring sense that whatever happens, you remain yourself. At this moment, you do not need to memorize each virtue. You do not need to evaluate whether you are enough. Simply notice this. When character has an axis, the mind no longer needs to strain. And when the mind stops straining, the body is allowed to soften. The breath slows. The shoulders drop. Sleep arrives not because every problem has been solved, but because you have an anchor. An anchor does not keep a ship perfectly still in a storm, but it keeps it from capsizing. For this night, that is enough. And when character has found its axis, when the four virtues become the anchor that keeps us from capsizing amid life's chaos, we begin to understand this. True power does not lie in controlling others, but in not allowing the darkness within us to take the wheel. Rome trembled, not because of a single enemy, but because of things that could not be clearly seen. A spreading plague, prolonged wars, simmering rebellions. It was an age in which death did not arrive as bad news. It arrived as part of the air itself. And at the center of that upheaval stood a man at the height of power, who chose a very different kind of power. Marcus Aurelius did not prevail through anger. He did not use fear to control the crowd. He did not turn instability into an excuse for inner violence. He chose self-mastery. In Meditations, the lines Marcus wrote were not meant for history. They were reminders to himself, written in military tents, written amid plague, written when the body was exhausted and the spirit worn thin. He reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That strength did not make the plague disappear. It did not end the wars overnight, but it prevented fear from becoming a storm inside the mind, the kind of storm that can destroy more than any enemy. In the language of Carl Gustav Jung, Marcus was someone who accomplished something rare. He withdrew energy from the ego. The ego always wants to react, to assert itself, to prove its power. But in moments of crisis, every impulsive reaction from a leader spreads outward like shockwaves, touching the fate of millions. Jung once warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Marcus did not flee from his soul. He faced it every day, and because of that, he did not allow the darker parts, anger, fear, arrogance, to govern his decisions. There are moments when maturity is not about doing something grand. Maturity is not letting inner chaos spill outward. It is knowing when to stop before speaking words that wound. It is not allowing a momentary surge of anger to become long-term policy. It is not letting personal fear decide the fate of others. Marcus wrote himself a reminder that is deeply human and deeply real. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. Not retaliation, not counterattack, but refusing to let another person's darkness awaken the darkness within you. In Jungian psychology, this is the sign of an ego placed in its proper position. It does not disappear. It simply stops ruling. When the ego no longer monopolizes energy, responsibility has room to enter, and responsibility, unlike power, does not need display. Amid the plague, Marcus understood that what people fear most is not suffering, but disorientation. When leaders panic, crowds panic more intensely. When leaders grow angry, violence becomes reasonable. And so self-mastery ceased to be merely a personal virtue. It became a moral obligation. Marcus reminded himself each morning, with clarity and without illusion. Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial. He did not write this out of pessimism. He wrote it so as not to be shocked by human nature. When we abandon illusions, we react less extremely. When we react less extremely, we cause less harm. In modern life, you may not lead an empire, but each person leads some domain: a family, relationships, work, one's own inner life. And in times of tension, illness, crisis, loss, the question is not what will happen, but rather, who will take the wheel inside you? If fear takes it, it will demand rushed decisions. If anger takes it, it will seek someone to unload upon. If a wounded ego takes it, it will try to prove power. Jung once said something profoundly clarifying. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Marcus did not imagine himself as light. He simply refused to let the darkness drive. And sometimes, that is the highest thing a human being can do. On some nights, as you listen to these words, you may be carrying a heavy burden yourself. You may be in a position where you must decide, must take responsibility, must remain calm for others, and you may be very tired. If so, remember this. Self-mastery does not mean feeling nothing. It means not allowing unexamined emotions to determine action. It is the small pause between stimulus and response, the place where character can step in. Marcus Aurelius did not leave us a method for avoiding crisis. He left us a way of passing through crisis without losing ourselves. And in Jung's world, that is the mark of a person who has withdrawn energy from the ego and given it to something greater: responsibility to life. At this moment, you do not need to become strong. You do not need to be okay right away. Just remember this: darkness does not disappear because we deny it, but because we do not grant it the power to decide. When you allow yourself to retain that power, even quietly, even faintly, a calm begins to spread. Not loudly, not as a victory, just as something deeply human. I am here, and I am not causing further harm to anyone, including myself. And within that self-mastery, sleep arrives as a quiet reward. Not because the world has grown calm, but because within you, there is someone awake enough to keep watch over this night. And when a person has learned not to let the darkness within determine the fate of others, when the greatest form of power has been gathered back into inner self-mastery, a deeper and more ancient question quietly emerges in the night. In the end, what is all of this for? We are born, then we die. And between those 2 points, we try to construct a story solid enough to live inside. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We cannot endure pure randomness. We need a thread, a reason, a why, so that our days do not slip through our fingers like sand. When we do not know where we come from or where we are going, we become hungry for meaning. That hunger is not in the stomach. It lives deep in the chest, where we place questions about the value of existence. So we light candles. Religion is one candle. Love is another candle. Achievement, career, reputation, other candles still. They illuminate the darkness in different ways. They give us the feeling that our lives have direction, that pain has a purpose, that effort has a destination. But there are times when the wind blows very hard, a loss, a betrayal, an illness, a failure, and the candles are extinguished one by one. We are left standing, hands empty, staring into a darkness that no longer holds familiar shapes. That emptiness has a name: nihilism. Nihilism does not arrive as a villain. It comes like a long, moonless night. It whispers, if there is no given meaning, is anything still worth doing? And that question frightens many people, not because it is cruel, but because it is naked. No promises, no guarantees, only the truth that we are alive, and that one day we will not be. Friedrich Nietzsche called this moment the death of old values. He wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. But if that why collapses, if the reason for living that once held us up can no longer stand, what happens? We do not merely grieve, we lose our direction." In the psychology of Carl Gustav Jung, nihilism is not only a philosophical position, it is a symbolic crisis. Jung understood that the human psyche needs images, stories, symbols to orient its life energy. When old symbols lose their power, the energy does not disappear. It wanders. And wandering energy, when unsupported, easily sinks into depression, doubt, or inner violence. Jung wrote, "Man cannot live without meaning, not because meaning is always given, but because the soul needs an axis around which to turn. When that axis breaks, every movement becomes chaotic." But listen very carefully. Nihilism does not say that life is meaningless. It says that meaning is no longer handed to us. This is a painful truth, but also an opening. When the wind has blown out the old candles, our eyes slowly adjust to the dark. And in that darkness, we may begin to see things the old light once concealed. Albert Camus, who went very deep into this territory, wrote, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." Camus did not deny the absurd. He lived alongside it. He did not try to cover life with a borrowed meaning. He asked, can we live decently even without metaphysical guarantees? And his answer, very quietly, was yes, if we choose action over despair. Jung stands with Camus here in his own way. He does not demand that we believe in a grand meaning immediately. He simply invites us to listen to the unconscious, where small fragments of meaning are waiting to be connected. Jung wrote, "Meaning makes many things endurable, perhaps everything. Meaning, in this view, is not a truth imposed from the outside. It is a process. It is woven from small choices, repeated actions, responsibilities we accept, even when we are not sure where we are going. Perhaps tonight you are standing in that empty space. No religion feels solid enough. No achievement tastes sweet enough. No story feels believable anymore. And you fear that if you admit this, everything will collapse. But try another possibility. Perhaps this is not a collapse, but a necessary silence. Silence so you can stop borrowing other people's meanings. Silence so you can listen for what, within you, is still beating. Nihilism, when faced directly, does not demand despair. It demands maturity. Maturity is accepting that life does not owe us a complete explanation. And within that acceptance, we can choose to live in a way that does not betray life. Fragile as it is, finite as it is. Jung once said something very still. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. To accept that we do not have final answers. To accept that meaning may arrive late, slowly, in fragments. To accept that we can still be decent, still love, still take responsibility, even when the sky remains silent. At this moment, you do not need to relight all the candles. Sometimes one small light is enough. One right thing to do tomorrow. One action that does no harm. One choice that does not betray your conscience. Meaning, if it comes, often follows action. It rarely precedes it. And when you allow yourself to remain in that empty space, without running away, without denial, without rushing to fill it, another kind of quiet appears. Not quiet because everything is understood, but quiet because you are no longer fighting the question. In that quiet, sleep may come, not as an answer, but as a rest between two questions. We are born, then we die. And between those 2 points, tonight, this is enough. We are here, breathing, and we do not need to know everything in order to be at peace. And when we dare to remain within the empty space of the question, what is the meaning of life? When we no longer rush to relight the old candles, another truth reveals itself. Sharper, more stripped bare, yet also more honest. Nihilism is not pessimism. Pessimism still believes there is something called the good. It simply feels too distant, too difficult to reach. Pessimism still fixes its gaze toward the light, even when that light exhausts us. Nihilism is different. Nihilism asks directly, what is good and why should we believe in it? When that question arises, it is not because human beings are weak, but because they have stopped pretending. Nihilism is the moment the mind stands naked. No protection, no consolation, no guarantees. When the value frameworks that once upheld us, religion, tradition, norms, success, collapse one by one, a person finds themselves standing in an open field. There is freedom there, but there is also cold wind and no signposts. Friedrich Nietzsche named this moment in a voice that is both lucid and dangerous. He wrote, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." When old values dissolve, human beings are not only freed from constraints, they also lose the frame that once restrained them. Freedom without inner orientation quickly turns into disorientation. In the language of Carl Gustav Jung, this is not merely a philosophical crisis, it is a crisis of symbols. Symbols are the images, stories, and ideas that allow the human psyche to locate itself in the world. When symbols die, the mind no longer has a map. Jung wrote, "The loss of meaning in life plays a crucial role in neurosis, not because life suddenly becomes meaningless, but because the structures that once carried meaning no longer speak to the unconscious. When the old map no longer works, psychic energy begins searching for another route. And without a sufficiently deep new orientation, people tend to choose two familiar paths, following the crowd or following the shadow. Following the crowd is the easiest way to avoid questioning. When we do not know what to believe, we borrow the beliefs of the majority. When we do not know how to live, We copy the lifestyles being celebrated. But that sense of safety is fragile because the crowd changes direction quickly, and we are lost again. Following the shadow is more dangerous. When belief in the good collapses, a person may be tempted to believe that nothing is wrong. Skepticism, if not held by conscience, can slide into coldness, cynicism, or inner violence. Jung warned very directly. When an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. If we do not face the inner void, that void will seek to fill itself through unconscious choices that can harm both ourselves and others. But listen slowly. Nihilism is not the enemy. It is a fever signaling that a value system has died and that maturity is being demanded. Fever exhausts us, but it is also evidence that the body is fighting to restore balance. Albert Camus, who looked directly into the absurd, did not call nihilism an ending. He called it a starting point for a new kind of courage. He wrote, "The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion." The rebellion Camus spoke of was not destruction. It was living responsibly in a world without guarantees, not borrowing ready-made meaning, not denying emptiness, simply choosing to act in ways that do not betray one's humanity. Jung agreed with this, in his own way. He did not demand that we immediately believe in a grand meaning. He only asked that we rebuild symbols from lived experience. Jung wrote, "Meaning makes many things endurable, perhaps everything." Meaning here is not a slogan. It is an inner process, formed when we dare to take responsibility for our choices, even without a map. When all old value frameworks collapse, human beings are both freed and disoriented. But disorientation is not failure. It is a transitional stage, like the darkness before the eyes adjust to see the stars. Perhaps right now, you are listening to these words with a familiar feeling. You no longer believe as you once did, yet you do not know what to believe in next. If so, know this: you are not broken. You are in a phase of transformation. Nihilism does not ask you to despair. It simply removes crutches that have rotted away. And when those crutches fall, you are forced to learn to stand on your own legs, trembling, but real. Jung once said something very still, like a reminder in the night. The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong. Between meaning and meaninglessness, the mind swings, and it is within that swinging that balance is learned, not by clinging immediately to a new belief, but by remaining with uncertainty without betraying conscience. At this moment, you do not need to define what good is. You only need to avoid what makes you more cruel. You do not need to believe in eternal meaning. You only need to do one thing that causes no further harm. Sometimes, that is a sufficient map for one night. And when you allow yourself not to know, yet still choose to live decently, something strange happens. The void stops threatening. It becomes space. Space to breathe. Space to listen. Space for new symbols, small, human, quiet, to begin forming. In that nakedness, sleep may come. Not because you have found meaning, but because you have stopped running from the truth. Nihilism, when fully embraced, does not take life away. It gives back something more precious, honesty with oneself. And when the old frameworks of value have dissolved, when we can no longer cling to collective answers, another question, quieter, deeper, naturally emerges. Without those familiar labels, who are we beyond the name we call ourselves? There is an idea that is very simple, yet when we touch it, the entire mind softens. The self is not our essence, it is a structure, a necessary structure, created so that we can live in society, communicate, work, and protect ourselves. But when we forget that it is a structure, confusion begins. We start to believe that we are the role, the identity, the image that others see. Carl Gustav Jung called the self the ego, the center of consciousness, but not the center of the whole person. He wrote very clearly, "The ego is only the center of consciousness, not the center of the personality." Yet much of human suffering is born from living as if the ego were everything. We defend it, embellish it, compare it, fear its injury, and then every criticism, every failure, every cold glance becomes a direct attack on me. When nihilism has stripped away borrowed meanings, when we no longer rely on external standards to define ourselves, a new possibility appears. The ego begins to thin. It does not disappear. It does not collapse. It simply becomes less dense, less rigid, less dominating of inner space. And when the boundary between me and not me softens, what arises is not chaos, but calm, a very unusual kind of calm. Not excitement, not numbness, just the absence of strain, the absence of having to assert again and again that I am this, that I must be that. Jung once said something that may sound frightening at first, but is in fact deeply liberating. People confuse becoming conscious with knowing oneself. Consciousness is not identical with knowledge. We do not need to know who we are in any fixed sense. We only need to be aware that we are alive and allow that life to move. When the ego thins, we stop turning every experience into a story about me. Sadness is no longer my sadness. Success is no longer proof that I have value. Failure is no longer I am a loser. In that state, we do not separate from the world. We are less separated. Not in a vague, dissolving way, but in a very lucid one. We no longer stand opposite life as someone who must constantly defend themselves. We participate without clinging. Most suffering does not come from what happens. It comes from the story the ego tells about what happens. Jung called this identification when we mistake ourselves for a role, an emotion, a memory. He warned, identification with the ego is the original sin of consciousness. When we fully identify with the ego, every change becomes a threat. But when the ego thins, we begin to see a very gentle truth. Everything comes and goes, including the images we once believed were us. Perhaps as you listen now, you suddenly realize that much of your exhaustion has not come from living, but from having to prove who you are. Proving that you are good enough, right enough, worthy enough, special enough. The ego is never satisfied because it lives on comparison. But when the ego softens, another question arises, far kinder. If nothing needs to be proven, what remains? And the answer is often very simple. Breath, sensation, presence. Things that need no title. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Acceptance here does not mean self-love in a polished, idealized sense. It means allowing oneself to exist without justification. When we accept that the ego is only a layer of clothing, we do not need to tear it off. We only need to remember that we are not the garment. In this thinned state, suffering does not vanish completely, but it loses its heavy personalization. We stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and simply see, "This is happening." And that shift in inner language allows the entire nervous system to settle. There is a very deep peace in no longer fixing oneself to an image, peace from not having to hold a role, peace from not fearing loss of face, peace from not having to constantly edit oneself to meet expectations. In that peace, we realize that we do not need to become someone else in order to live fully. We only need not to cling. Jung called this the movement from ego to self, not a larger ego, but a wider whole, in which the ego is only a part. And when the ego is only a part, life is no longer a stage for proving oneself, but a current to participate in. We work, love, fail, succeed, without having to attach everything to identity. At this moment, you may feel a very real lightness. No conclusion is needed. No full understanding is required. Simply notice that when you stop asking, "Who am I?" the mind becomes quieter. And when the mind grows quiet, the body remembers its natural rhythm. Sleep comes in this state, not because you have solved yourself, but because you have stopped gripping an image of yourself. You do not need to disappear. You only need to thin a little. And in that very human thinning, the night becomes wide enough for rest, not as a name, but as a living being temporarily closing its eyes. And when the ego has thinned, when we no longer have to strain ourselves to prove who I am, a very human question appears again. Quiet, not philosophically lofty, but close to everyday life. Ultimately, do we want to live to feel comfortable or to feel real? There is an old promise that humanity has always been drawn to: pleasure. Hedonism whispers that life is meant to be enjoyed. Avoid pain. Seek pleasure. Maximize comfort. If it is possible to live without suffering, why not? The idea sounds reasonable, especially in a world already so exhausted. And yet, another question arises, not from philosophy books, but from lived experience. Why do the most pleasant moments so quickly become dull? And why, even when offered an endless chain of pleasures, do human beings hesitate? Robert Nozick once proposed a famous thought experiment. The experience machine, a machine that could give you every feeling of happiness, success, and love, all perfectly simulated. He asked, "Would you enter the machine?" Most people answer no, not because the machine lacks pleasure, but because it lacks reality. We do not only want sensations, we want reality. Here, flow appears as a subtler promise, not indulgence, but immersion. Immersion in what we are doing. Losing the sense of time. Forgetting the ego. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described flow as the state in which human beings feel most alive, not because of extreme pleasure, but because all mental energy is placed exactly where it belongs. Yet even flow does not eliminate pain. On the contrary, it often requires discipline, challenge, failure, repetition. Flow does not arise from comfort. It arises from commitment. And here, a very quiet truth reveals itself. Whether pleasure or immersion, human beings still do not choose a life without pain. We choose a life that is real, even when that reality sometimes brings tears. Carl Gustav Jung understood this deeply. He did not believe that the goal of life was happiness in the sense of comfort. He believed the goal was wholeness. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Consciousness does not grow in pure pleasure. It grows when we touch our limits, when we fail, when we love and risk loss, when we commit to something that may wound us. Pain, in that sense, is not a mistake. It is the cost of living truthfully. Human beings do not only want joy, we want our life story to have weight. A story that, when we look back, we can say, I was there, not merely consuming sensations, but participating." Albert Camus, who never avoided the absurdity of life, wrote, "Real generosity toward the future lies in giving all to the present. To give all here does not mean blind sacrifice. It means full engagement, with both joy and pain. A life of only pleasure is a thin life. A life of only suffering is a blocked life. But a life that contains both, chosen consciously, is a life with depth." Jung would say that if we chase only pleasure, we are fleeing the shadow. If we chase only challenge, we are fleeing softness. Psychological maturity is the ability to remain with both without letting either take control. Perhaps this is why, when given the choice, people still choose a real life. A life with risk, with loss, with days that cannot be emotionally optimized, but also with moments that are undeniably real, when the heart trembles with love, when the hands tremble with responsibility, when tears fall for something that truly matters. Jung once said something very close to this spirit. Life really does begin at 40. Up until then, you are just doing research. Not because life before that is false, but because it takes a long time to stop trying to live easily and to begin living truthfully. True to oneself, true to limits, true to the fact that a life without pain is also a life without depth. When we understand this, pleasure is no longer the enemy. It simply stops being king. We can enjoy, but not trade ourselves away for enjoyment. We can seek flow, but not use it to escape the difficult parts of life. Perhaps tonight you are listening to these words in a very human state. Tired of having to be okay, tired of having to find happiness, tired of feeling that if you are not happy, you must be living wrong. If so, let one very gentle thought pass through. You do not need to feel comfortable all the time to be living rightly. You only need to live truthfully, with what you do, what you love, and what you carry. The weight of life does not come from avoiding pain. It comes from hurting for what is worth hurting for, rejoicing in what is worth rejoicing in, and not denying any part of it. Jung believed that when a person lives truthfully enough, sleep changes as well. Not the sleep of someone exhausted from running away, but the sleep of someone who has been fully present in their day. At this moment, you do not need to choose between pleasure and immersion. You only need to choose to stay. Stay with the sensations in the body. Stay with your life story, even if it is not yet perfect. And when you allow life to contain both joy and pain, without judgment, without optimization, something very calm happens. You no longer need a machine to be happy. You already have a life with weight, with reality. And in that reality, sleep arrives very softly, not as a reward, but as a natural continuation of a day that has been lived. And when we have accepted a life that contains both joy and pain, when we no longer try to optimize sensations, but choose to live truthfully, a final question, quiet yet persistent, appears at the edge of consciousness. If suffering is unavoidable, was being born itself a mistake? Some people arrive at this question by a very direct path. They look at war, illness, injustice, and loss, and ask, if life is filled with suffering like this, why be born at all? From there, antinatalism emerges as a cold and logical argument. If one is not born, there will be no suffering. If there is no life, there will be no harm. This is not a shallow line of thought. It arises from compassion, from the desire not to create additional suffering. And yet, precisely here, another question must be asked, more slowly. Is suffering only something to be avoided, or is it also something that calls for a response? Fyodor Dostoevsky did not argue against antinatalism with theory. He did not write to win debates. He told stories in which human beings stand before suffering and must choose how to live. In The Brothers Karamazov, he left behind a sentence that is harsh, yet profoundly honest. Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared with love in dreams. Love in dreams is easy. Arguments in the mind are neat and clean. But love in action, bending down, caring, taking responsibility, is always tangled in the mud of real life. Dostoevsky seems to suggest that the answer to suffering does not lie in what we think about existence, but in what we do when we face it. There are people who argue brilliantly about the pain of the world, and there are people who, in silence, bend down to help a child get through the day. These two things do not exclude one another, but they are not the same. One is thought, the other is action. And here, philosophy begins to change its tone from sharp and cold to gentle. Carl Gustav Jung understood very clearly that the darkness of life does not disappear because we understand it. Understanding, when it stands alone, can become a very subtle refuge for helplessness. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Making darkness conscious does not mean allowing it to rule. It means taking responsibility for how we live with it. Jung would not tell you to deny suffering, nor would he tell you to glorify it. He would simply ask, will you let the darkness pass through you, or pass through others because of you? Antinatalism questions existence. Dostoevsky questions responsibility. And Jung weaves the two together with a very fine thread. Darkness softens not when we explain it away, but when we live in a way that prevents it from spreading. Perhaps life has no absolute moral guarantee. Perhaps there is no single answer that fits everyone, but there is a deeply human, very practical principle. Do not add more harm. If we cannot erase the suffering of the world, we can reduce its intensity within the reach of our own hands. Dostoevsky once wrote something that sounds paradoxical at first, yet resonates deeply. The mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for. Though the wording varies across translations, the spirit is clear. Life is not justified by the absence of pain, but by what we are willing to carry for others. It is not belief that saves us, but small actions repeated quietly. Jung would say that human beings are not healed by perfect ideas, but by integration, by allowing both light and shadow to have a place, without giving destructive forces the power to decide. In everyday life, this is very simple. Choosing not to unload anger onto someone weaker. Choosing care when possible. Choosing presence over judgment. And so philosophy, after a long journey through control, virtue, crises of meaning, the thinning of the ego, and the choice of a real life, finally becomes a lullaby. Not a lullaby that puts us to sleep with certain answers, but one that offers a very calm feeling. We do not need to solve all suffering in order to live decently today. Belief matters less than action, not because belief is meaningless, but because action is where belief is tested by fire. Perhaps tonight you still carry unanswered questions. Perhaps you still doubt meaning, existence, or the value of being born. That does not make you less compassionate. But remember this: between questions, there is always a pause where you can choose to do one thing that does not cause more harm. Jung believed that maturity does not mean becoming perfectly enlightened, but becoming trustworthy in the presence of life. Trustworthy in the sense that when darkness appears, you don't let it borrow your hands. In that spirit, antinatalism is not dismissed with slogans. It is placed beside another choice: to live in such a way that, if life continues, it is less cruel because you are here. At this moment, you do not need to choose a doctrine. You only need to choose a gesture, a small action, unremarkable, not heroic, but one that doesn't add to suffering. Philosophy, in the end, doesn't conclude with a proposition. It concludes with how we place our hands upon life. And when those hands are placed gently enough, truthfully enough, darkness does not disappear, but it stops spreading. In that stopping, the body is allowed to relax. The breath finds its slower rhythm. Sleep arrives like a silent agreement between you and life. Tonight, you do not need to answer everything. You only need not to add more pain. That is enough.